Morning, everyone. Paul Beyer here. Welcome to our daily GenAI executive briefing, where we discuss and rate our top news items. I'm Paul Beyer from GA Insights, and our team of AI analysts rate each article as essential, important, or optional for executives and leaders at companies and for investors. Today's briefing is sponsored by GAI Insights. So the first uh, story we have is from Mistral dropping a torrent link to a new open source model that's gotten a lot of buzz. Let me display this. Julio or others, thoughts? Yet another model? Do we care? Is this a tree falls in the woods? No one notices?
Yeah, I'm going to say optional. This was a really weird release. It was just a link. There was no documentation. There was no code. There was no report. There's no paper with it or anything like that. People spent the weekend trying to figure out what it did and what it was. It seems to be a mixture of experts model where there's a part of a neural network that's in there that's trained to send it to one of multiple. I think there are 8 Mistral models in there. But it's unclear. It's not a product. It's unclear how well it works. The mixture of experts is an interesting research angle, but it takes a lot of resources. So the benefits of a smaller model are kind of taken away. So it's unclear yet what this is. It might turn into a really nice model, but we don't know yet.
Yep, it's an indication that Mistral is solidly in the open source camp,
Yeah.
and they're playing, under what's the word, under promise and over deliver in that sense. So they just literally released this with no documentation or press release or anything, in stark contrast to Google last week, which we'll talk about in a moment. The mixture of experts thing is interesting. Julio, they said that GPT-4 from OpenAI was also a mixture of experts, which I did not realize. Did you know that?
That is the theory. I don't know that OpenAI ever explicitly confirmed that, but the idea was back in the summer somebody said, or there was some hints or leaks or whatever that GPT-4 was a mixture of experts. But we don't know how it was implemented. Mixture of experts can be implemented with a completely separate model. I believe in this case the routing part that chooses which expert to use is actually part of the model. It's unclear how this all works.
So this is again interesting from a technical, and perhaps ultimately could become important because certainly this is my bias. I'm a big distributed computing fan and Society of Mind fan back from Marvin Minsky, which says you're going to do a lot better with smaller models that are linked together with expertise than one big model, and that's what mixture of experts is. There's a route is much more like the human brain in that sense. There's a router that sends things to functional experts. And this one is a good order of magnitude, maybe 2 orders of magnitude smaller than OpenAI's ChatGPT-4. So we'll see, but it's I would agree optional. Yeah. Interesting for the tech wizards, but
so it sounds like optional. The other note is they just raised $400 million. And if I'm an investor and put $400 million in the same week that Bard, Gemini's coming out, and Grok and Amazon Q, and there's no press around this,
yeah,
but that's what I wanted to touch on, the no press. I think it's kind of interesting, the timing of it, right? Because the next article we're going to review is that the EU just passed some laws, right? And in those laws, it's like, hey, you have to have things documented. You have to provide information on how these models are working. So I think these guys were trying to just, let me squeeze this out before I'm going to get, fined 2 million euros if I don't have the documentation, because I'm moving so fast. I haven't put the documentation together yet. So I thought it was kind of interesting, their approach. I think it's more of, let me just get in, now before the rules apply. The other thing I was going to say to what you were saying, Tim, like it reminds me of like old ways of doing things where, I come from a network perspective. So I was thinking load balancing, we used to have like this virtual IP address, and then that would redirect the traffic based on whatever, logic you were saying. And it seems like that's what's now. It's like in the middle, you have this, I don't know, logic that's going to determine, okay, you go to this expert, that expert, that expert. So it was interesting. What I found the most interesting of the article was the distribution, right? Of just pieces of it being everywhere. I had never heard of that term torrent link until this article, and I did researched it, and it was interesting how they just spread the code apart.
So it sounds like optional for that. Next one is the new AI regulation in Europe. Does anyone not think this is essential?
I think we probably are in violent agreement on this one.
Yeah. Is there any key items people want to note of this?
Well, they did, to your point, Tanya, actually, they exempted foundation models from most of the regulations. So this was hard lobbying from Aleph Alpha and Mistral, and it was successful. And so it appears that this is just the proposal. So, it's like Congress has a draft bill in the United States. So we'll see what actually gets enacted. But as of now, foundation models are mostly exempt.
Yeah, and that is huge.
Yep.
Because then, and I think a lot of companies will go that way because of that and use the open models.
But if I'm an AI executive, am I looking at Europe 6, 9, 12 months ahead of regulation of any other country?
That has been the trend. That certainly was a trend with like GDPR. So I think they felt flat-footed with the release of the startup of social media 20 years ago, and they've still not forgotten that. So they are aggressive about getting to regulation early, and they certainly are the first. Well, China's done regulation, but China's an autocracy, so they just say, here it is, it's done. But this is certainly the first large-scale democratic institution that has put together this level of regulation.
And it's rather comprehensive. So what is absolutely stunning that they pulled their act together and released something rather comprehensive. So it's quite.
Yeah. Well, they started this 3 or 4 years ago, as I recall, at least, because they were already starting it because of the problems and bias of what we now call legacy or traditional AI, which is pretty new. So these profiling programs before that were already showing bias long before there was generative AI, and then generative AI just accelerated the process.
Yeah, I was in a couple of meetings with some of the European regulators doing this stuff, and it's an interesting attitude. They very much want to lead in regulation globally, so that's conscious.
John, I thought your comment last week about having principles that move into common practice was a really precedent one. And I thought some of the text here seemed very practical, at least in the spirit of trying to get to what responsible AI might look like.
Yeah, what's interesting is that the folks like the effective altruists and things like that who have come up, I don't really understand. I don't think they have any kind of consistent or thought through philosophical utility. And so it's interesting because it's episodic. It's kind of like some half-baked utilitarianism, that works except when it doesn't. It's going to be interesting to see, because when they say, something like, we don't want to model to harm anyone, it's like, okay, well, that's a hard thing to calculate between the population and individual,
But the thing I saw, John, that was interesting was at least it had some specifics. No one can use it for social scores. That's a good specific thing to debate if that's in or out of a regulation.
Or behavior, or allow free will.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of what we learned through social media, like you guys are saying, is being applied here to make sure we're not manipulated.
I have questions about all of that, though. I don't know how any of this stuff is going to be defined, and I'm not a legal person at all. So, but first of all, what is AI? If you talk to a marketing department, everything is AI. So even traditional machine learning is AI, right? So if they fall in that direction, that's going to be a problem, because I think ads manipulate your behavior. I think lead scoring is social scoring, and how are we going to define those things? So then that means all of these traditional uses of machine learning, and even statistics and analytics, because even analytics is AI these days. Those will be a question. So I expect, well, from my naive reading of this, I would expect tons of lawsuits about everything and people not being able to.
They're gonna have to set boundaries and precedent. But again, that was the original target. It was exactly what you're talking about, Julio. That was the original target, was influencing and manipulating people towards dwell time, as it's called, advertisement, all that stuff was the initial target. So that is what they're aiming for. And there will be
So-
lots of interesting pushback, I'm sure.
Okay.
So for our target customer, absolutely essential. Triple underline. The third story in terms of time is Google cannot get their marketing act together and admitted they faked some of the, or at least modified some of the Gemini demo.
Yep.
Gossipy optional.
Bad optics, no matter what the reality is. Maybe Bard will turn out to be the greatest model since sliced bread, but this is the stark contrast between what Mistral did and what Google did. And the amazing thing is that Google had so much hubris, they did not think it would be discovered immediately on the internet. And of course it was. And, you know, they showed some pretty impressive things. If you read through it, it's still kind of impressive, but it's definitely fake. This was definitely put together to look much better than the actual process. Now, the actual process may still be pretty good. We'll see. But it was definitely sleight of hand, a lot of sleight of hand going on here.
But optional, Tim, or others?
I would say important because people need to know what is actually possible and what is not possible, and not continue believing that Gemini will be able to do all these things right out of the gate.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it really tells you how pressured Google feels, you know, to catch up. That's for sure.
So it sounds like important. I mean, Julio, I really feel for the AI engineers over there on DeepMind who've been working their ass off for 6 months and probably have a decent thing that's close or slightly better than GPT, and to be a laughing stock.
Yeah.
That's what happened the last time when they first introduced Bard, too. They need to get their PR act together.
Just some heads need to roll. This is debacle. So it's important. So the next article is OpenAI taps a former Twitter India head to kickstart the country. This is
optional to me. I mean, you know, they're just doing business expansion as one would expect. India is an important market.
Does anyone not think this is optional?
Nope.
Okay, optional. And then last one, and I'll display it here a second, is better, cheaper, faster large language models using this KTO method from Context AI, who's led by a Stanford graduate.
I think this is another one like the first one that's technically really interesting for people more interested in digging a little bit into it. I would say it's optional right now for the AI executive. This could be a watershed moment, but we won't know for a while, because the use of better mathematics to automate alignment is the holy grail right now. You know, if you could find some scalable way of gaining alignment and maybe even working harder on hallucinations, that would increase trust dramatically in these models. So that's the claim here, and we'll have to see. They have some good evidence in their research, but you know, the practical reality is what counts, and they've just released it.
So Julio, optional but interesting. It's on the lab.
Yeah, same thing Tim said. And what's also interesting is that the trick is really, really simple, I think. So
yep,
it's kind of amazing.
really simple.
It's kind of amazing. Yeah, but it might be really useful in the future. So optional.
Yeah. But technically,
one thing. Oh, go ahead, Luda.
Technically, it is important. It's a opening of a path or a trend. Everybody is working on that, and they're making headways in that. So this is important. But as Tim said, we don't know what it would amount to later. So
And it's a vendor claim, right?
yeah, it's optional.
Yeah.
Well, there is some research. They did some research.
I'm thinking it's important as well. And I think because, you know, it's kind of like if we go back to when we were doing searches on the internet, and it took a while until then we realized, okay, there's a whole career in searching optimization and all of that. And that's what made Google, you know, so powerful. I think here in this article, they're talking about human behavior and how to understand how human makes this, how we make decisions. And I don't know, they quote some kind of paper, right? That's what this whole thing is based on. I think that because of that, that's important. I think there's a whole new field, and I think we've talked about this before, a whole new field of careers that are going to come out that we just don't know. It's too early. I think this idea of understanding how we make decisions, what makes us behave in a different way, that's going to take off with things like this. So from that perspective, I think it's important.
But Tanya, from an AI leader standpoint, should they change their plans for 2024, 25 from this, or just monitor this, or?
Well, they're the ones asking what kind of AI talent do I need, right? So I think that as they optimize their internal operations, and we know, they're going to cut heads, they need to bring new talent, they need to bring new skills. What are those skills that they're going to look for? It's not just the technical AI side, it's also that, I don't know what you call it, the psychology, behavioral, that side of skills is also going to be very important.
So sounds like a bunch of votes for optional, one for important. Any other important votes? All right, Tanya, can you live with optional?
I can live with optional.
Okay, great, thank you. One thing I want to, this is the last one I want to bring up. There's a good debate a little bit. I've had this before and was on LinkedIn last night, was a whole word of hallucinations. And one of the things we saw last week in some employee training we were doing with a company we're working with is that when you say hallucination, the new learner comes in and assume that means an error. And that's just a simple bug, Julio, that will eventually go away, rather than also being almost a feature in a probabilistic model. And actually got me really thinking about, is the word hallucination actually a misnomer? It's a misnomer. It shouldn't be called.
It is.
Yeah.
I wrote this in my first article. I hate is too strong a word. I dislike anthropomorphization. That is attaching human characteristics to something that is not human. And it confuses people. They are errors, but they're a different kind of error. And they have to be treated as such.
And Tim, one of the things you saw on the training, it was 40, 50 people there. These are people kind of learning for the first time. And they said, I don't want to use this work because it hallucinates.
Right.
Because I went in there, and because you use the word hallucinate, I assume perfection rather than coming in and saying this is a probabilistic model. And
right.
The probabilistic thing is actually a feature of it that will really help you when you were creating.
It's a feature in some circumstances, and it is a problem in other circumstances. But yeah, if you're generating ideas for taglines for a product, it's a feature, right? If you're diagnosing a patient, it's a problem.
Dave, you do a lot of writing about AI. What's your view on this? Do you use this term, or do you find your readers confused by it?
I use the term. I think it's been around long enough at this point that a lot of people understand it, but I mean, I appreciate what Tim was saying and what you were saying in terms of it potentially affecting a novice user. I think the term is okay. I think obviously it's an education issue, right? I mean, no matter what you call it, you're going to have to explain what it actually is. And I think Tim just kind of like summed it up well, right? Hallucination, you can think of it as dreaming, right? Dreaming up when you're in a creative endeavor, and that's a positive thing. Hallucination, when you're doing something fact-based, is a negative thing. So the term doesn't bother me. Just helping people understand when it's a positive and a negative, I think, is just really the key.
I'm actually wondering, I might start just using, when I refer to it in writing, called the so-called quote hallucination. I mean, Julio, if you actually think about the design point of this, think the design point said, Julio, please go build me a large language model that has a probabilistic outcome. You will fail the test if it always gives the exact same answer. So you go build a widget that's design point and passes QA because it has a probabilistic answer. And then to call that a bug is really, I think it's a huge misnomer. Anyway, certainly employee training, it's a very confusing misnomer. Great. Any other contributions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I heard a term recently that instead of hallucination, somebody expressed the same idea. Unfortunately, I can't remember what the heck the term was. But it was
confabulation.
Confabulation, maybe. Yeah.
It's used a lot. I just think it's impossible not to humanize, anthropomorphize, whatever you want. It's literally in our DNA. It is impossible. When you see text that looks that convincing, you can't avoid saying in your internal hormones, basically telling you, wow, that's human. It's thinking, it's reasoning. Yeah. And I think we have to combat that, because even if it is in some strange way, it's not doing it the way, this is John's point, it's not doing it the way humans do.
Yeah.
And you need to be aware of that in order to use it as an effective tool.
And Tim, I actually want to double underline that. That's on a negative side. Also, when it comes back, the answers come back fast. I mostly.
Yep. And written text is generally considered, you know, your general, again, literally DNA hormonal take of written text gives it more credence than spoken text.
Yeah, I mean, I think the language of probability, enough people, you know, have some intuition for it that if you say, look, it's making an estimate as to what, you know, is a good answer. And most of the time that estimate's right.
Right.
And every once in a while, it's an excellent estimate.
Right.
Every once in a while, the estimate's wrong.
Yeah.
And most of the world, by the way, is probabilistic. You know, when you drive down the freeway, you don't drive in a perfectly straight line. You drive probabilistically within a lane. And that's all you have to do is when you get too close to the edge, you move back to the middle.
As well stated. And yeah, and not only that, it's perfectly fine. The world works fine staying in that lane here.
Yep.
That's a great analogy.
It does.
The world's not perfect. The models aren't either, you know, whatever.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. We'll finish that then. We'll see everyone tomorrow. Thank you.